A huge thank you to all the super sponsors who make it possible for me to make these videos. Visit David X Newton on Patreon to join the ASCII Brigade. It really is hard to describe just how massive a deal the launch of the PlayStation was. It was released towards the end of 1995 in the West, though it had already been out for nearly a year in Japan. Even though the early starters, the Jaguar and 32X, had made their own attempts at stepping past the 16-bit era, the shift from the focus on sprite-based games to the three-dimensional excesses of the PlayStation was a generational leap unlike any other upgrade the games industry had seen before. With a major leap in both processing power and storage space, the PS1 and its black CD-ROMs suddenly propelled Sony to the forefront of the console scene, leaving even the previous leaders trying to catch up. And starting up the PlayStation version of Doom quickly highlights this difference in underlying technology. While the ports we've seen so far used immensely clever programming tricks to just about run Doom with what resources they had available, the game feels much more at home on the PlayStation, where frankly I had to spend a while getting my brain used to seeing the environment move around so smoothly again. It's obvious that the frame rate is far in excess of any of the other ports, and it does it at the highest resolution for a console port yet, with no screen borders and no horizontal doubling. The controls feel much more natural as well. The PlayStation's double shoulder buttons suddenly give the rest of the controller some breathing space. As you would reasonably expect, the first pair lets you sidestep and the second pair is used to cycle back and forward between your weapons. This lets the standard fire, run and open controls exist on the face buttons, with an extra strafe-on button just lying around in case you need it. The fire button is set up on the top button triangle by default, which felt pretty odd to me, but happily all the buttons are customizable. The presentation of the game takes a noticeably different tack on this version, really leaning into Doom's darker and scarier side instead of the action game approach that it usually took on the PC. This is most obviously communicated in the game's completely new set of sound effects and music. The sounds feel more reverby, guttural and gloomier, and Bobby Prince's selection of Pantera and Slayer-styled background music is here replaced with a much more foreboding and atmospheric soundtrack reminiscent of a horror game. This selection of music was composed by Aubrey Hodges, a composer who has now worked on a very long list of games including Sierra's King's Quest adventures and a series of NASCAR games, coincidentally two very different series both about going pointlessly round in circles. This was the first full copy of Doom that I owned, and at the time I wasn't a fan of the new music, preferring the more actiony and tuneful soundtrack from the shareware PC game that I knew, but many other people thought otherwise, and I've since come to appreciate it as something that's different but still good in its own way. The new lighting effects also contribute to the darker atmosphere, first of all by being literally darker in many places than the PC or other console versions. However, uniquely to this version, sectors can have light colours assigned to them as well as brightnesses, tinting the visuals and the weapon in your HUD. And even the normally lighter levels have a new sense of foreboding when you're venturing down gloomy blue or dark red corridors. As a side effect, this makes the levels look a lot more varied. The PlayStation maps were derived from the Jaguar version, so the texture simplification is still intact, but applying coloured lighting counteracts the effect and gives the feeling of having more different textures and environments again. Mid-textures also sort of make a return in a new way, with transparent windows occupying some frames that once had see-through textures or were blank. And once you reach the hell levels, you'll see another feature new to this version in the form of the foreboding animated flaming sky. So far, the ports had all managed to carry over only about 22 of the PC's 27 levels, so it comes as a bit of a welcome surprise that this one contains 59. At the end of 1995, when this port was released, both Doom 2 and the fourth episode in Ultimate Doom had been out for a while, and so Williams decided to roll the levels and monsters from there into their copy of Doom as well. Altogether, the PC versions of Ultimate Doom and Doom 2 have 68 levels, and PlayStation Doom picks and chooses 28 from Ultimate and 23 from Doom 2 for a total of 51, mostly cutting out levels with particularly large footprints. This already formidable count is bolstered with the 2 extra levels from the Jaguar version, with the new Tower of Babel, now renamed to Hell Gate, and 6 completely new ones. Needless to say, there's quite a lot here to keep you going. The biggest cartridge version of Doom we've looked at managed to negotiate getting 4 MB of storage space, and the PlayStation CD format had 660 to work with, so it's no surprise that almost all the monsters from Doom and Doom 2 are present and functional in the game. This includes the bosses that had to be removed from the Jaguar version. The only exception is the Arch file, because for some technical reason or other, the developers felt there was no way he could go into the game without being cut down to an unsatisfactory level. They did, however, find room to fit a new monster in, although it's not an earth-shatteringly original one. These black demons, called Nightmare Spectres, behave like pinkies with double the health points. Interestingly, the way that the game stores monster data allows for some new flags to be toggled on and off to decide whether individual monsters should be transparent or inverted like this, so in theory it's possible to have nightmare versions of any monster. However, the flags weren't used beyond this single enemy type in the end, apart from a couple of ghostly monsters in later levels which were apparently left in by mistake. Like most of the other console conversions, the episode structure between level maps and story intermissions are almost entirely absent. The enormous collection of maps is arranged into just 2 episodes titled Ultimate Doom and Doom 2. At the end of the 33 map long Doom 1 chapter, you're given the message about freeing humanity like after the PC's Doom 2 map 11, with the 26 maps in the Doom 2 chapter now being the journey to the Hellgate on Earth. The Ultimate Doom half of the game is also odd in moving the ends of the sections of the game around. The first 9 maps are familiar from the Shareware episode, but then you go through a stretch of levels from episodes 2 and 3 before fighting the Cyber Demon in the Tower of Babel. After that, the maps from Thy Flesh Consumed serve as the third act of the Ultimate Doom part of the game, finishing with 2 exclusive PlayStation levels. The Doom 2 half is more straightforward, going through most of the original PC levels in the same order they originally existed, before finishing with a new boss level called Redemption Denied, which finally pits the player against the Spider Mastermind. There are also a couple of surprises earlier in the game. Experienced players will be disoriented by finding a pain elemental skulking around in the secret tunnel above E1M1, among other unexpected Doom 2 cameos. There are also a couple of secret levels unique to the PlayStation version, including the famous Club Doom super secret level where you get to see revenants shaking their bones on the dance floor. The background music for this level was composed by Danny Lewis, a QA engineer on the project who at the time was releasing electronic music under the name Techno Man. Interestingly, this is the only level in any official version of Doom where the music changes during the level, achieved by using a new line special that reacts when the player crosses it. Usually this kind of action is only available in modern source ports. As far as drawbacks go on the PlayStation, there really aren't all that many beyond the cuts that the Jaguar version had to make to the levels to get them to fit in memory and run acceptably. In fact, the Thy Flesh Consumed and Doom 2 levels that weren't taken from the Jaguar have had fewer cuts made to them, and they perform noticeably worse as a result. This only becomes a huge deal when you encounter the infamous bug where if a lost soul gets spawned outside the level, it can eventually float off and chew around in enough wires to distort reality into a non-Euclidean nightmare followed by a crash. Finally, there are a couple of other miscellaneous differences. With the presence of the Super Shotgun, the numbers on the weapon inventory display have been shifted so that it fits into slot 4, with slot 5 being the chain gun and so on. Which makes sense, but it can seriously interfere with the portion of your memory that knows the Doom weapon numbers. The Fast Monsters Nightmare skill level from the Jaguar has also been removed for unknown reasons, but the game really doesn't suffer without it. And as a new feature, this is the first of the Doom ports to use a password system, where the codes generated at the end of each level encode the map that you've reached along with your inventory, within a few points of rounding for your health and armour and so on. So the PlayStation version really took all the parts that had worked from the ports that it had been derived from, was able to live up to the original game a lot more fully due to having more hardware to throw at it, and added a couple of its own touches as well to produce a Doom game that was a bit different from the PC original but still very good on its own. Having done this port, the team also released their take on Final Doom a year later, which featured selections from the Doom 2 master levels along with TNT and Plutonia. On top of that, it inspired several total conversions. PlayStation Doom TC by Fender CO1 backports the PlayStation maps along with their look and feel to GZ Doom on the PC, and there are 2 projects by Team GEC for both GZ Doom and the PlayStation called the GEC Master Edition. This collection adds almost every official Doom map that was ever made, half-finished, rumoured or recently discovered in an archaeological dig. The 3DO is an unusual piece of console history, as it wasn't a single device made by a particular company, but instead a set of specifications that licensed manufacturers could build to. A bit like the idea of computers that are descended from the IBM PC today, which can be made by anyone but all share broadly similar components. The first model that was manufactured, which I'll address once by its absurd full name the Panasonic FZ1 REAL 3DO Interactive Multiplayer, was released in 1993, and 2 other models by Goldstar and Sanyo were also available by the time the 3DO got a version of Doom in 1996. This version was handled by Art Data Interactive, who had the supreme pedigree of also being the ones to handle the unreleased Jaguar port of Rise of the Robots. The CEO Randy Scott, depicted here in a police photo for crimes separate from this port, had extremely ambitious visions for the project. He wanted it to build on and surpass the PC version with new monsters, maps and weapons, but was severely hampered by his almost complete lack of understanding of how games were made. After acquiring the Jaguar code, sending out some overinflated press releases and mocking up a few FMV scenes with actors in silly costumes, he got in touch with Rebecca Heinemann to take on the task of actually building the game. Becky was one of the founding members of Interplay and had been working in games programming since the Atari 2600, and she also had a background in porting multiple other games on behalf of id Software. Randy brought her onto the project by lying to her about the status of the conversion and gave her 10 weeks to basically build the entire thing. What you're seeing now is the result of those 10 weeks. The finished game is pretty much identical to its parent, the Jaguar version, in appearance and content, but it's undeniable that it has some issues. The most obvious victim of the rushed nature of this port, apart from Becky herself of course, is the frame rate, which grinds almost to a halt whenever it's asked to draw a room in which you can see more than a few feet in front of you. A while ago I watched a video about Doom console port speedrunning by Karl Jobst, and it's for good reason that one of the major strategies for the 3DO version is to spend as much time as possible staring straight at walls so the game doesn't have to burden itself with rendering too much. As a result of the clunkiness, id Software refused to allow the game's release unless the viewport was limited to mitigate the frame rate issues. As a result, the game runs in an uncomfortably small window that can be even further reduced to get the performance up a bit. Ms. Heinemann was well aware of the inadequacies of the game's renderer, not having had nearly enough time to get it to where she wanted it to be before the release deadline. To make up for it, she came up with a small backdoor to future-proof the game. Anticipating that more powerful 3DO-based hardware might be on the way in the future, she kept the original screen sizes in the game but hid them behind a cheat code, so that the game might be able to take advantage of the added horsepower at some point. Unfortunately, the next generation of 3DO hardware, codenamed the M2, was never released, and so her version of Doom never got to run the way it deserved to. This really is a shame, because otherwise this port could have been quite acceptable. The overambitious promises of new weapons, high-resolution graphics and FMV sequences were never going to be fulfilled with just one overburdened programmer working on the game, but just getting it to a place where it replicated the quality of the Jaguar port would have been a good target. Becky was very capable of using some in-depth tricks to squeeze all she could out of the 3DO, and there's no reason to think she wouldn't have been able to make it comparable with the Jaguar given adequate time. In fact, with the magic of emulators, we can simulate soldering another couple of processors into the 3DO, and suddenly the game runs just about perfectly. This is what the game could have looked like if the development schedule hadn't been so unrealistic. There is one good thing that came out of the frenzied development deadline. With no time to write a driver to play back MIDI data and get it to run simultaneously with the game, Rebecca suggested instead using recorded audio files. So Randy Scott made himself useful by taking several of the Doom songs, heading into his garage and recording them with his band. With the state of his game project management in mind, I was looking forward to mocking the results, but the fact is the music is exceptional. It's a shockingly well-polished combination of guitars and synthesizers that really brings the original Doom music to life and sets it apart from the rest of the console ports. Despite the frame rate difficulties, the 3DO port also makes good use of the controller with its 3 face buttons and 2 shoulder buttons. Pressed alone, the shoulders act as dedicated strafe controls, and this makes at least the less graphically demanding parts of the game feel much smoother to play than the parent Jaguar port. And if pressed while holding down the open button, you can use them to cycle back and forward through your weapons. It's still not as fast as hitting a number key, but this solution for cramming all of the controls onto a joypad with limited buttons feels fairly comfortable. Sadly, this version came out when the 3DO was already on life support. If it had been an earlier port released in 1994, then maybe the slowness might have been overlooked, but its late release in 1996 put it well behind competing platforms, and particularly the hugely expanded PlayStation version. Only a few thousand copies sold out of the 50,000 that were manufactured, but at least this port gave us the music and the FMV Cyberdemon. Should you want it, the source code for this version is also available on Rebecca Heinemann's GitHub. The Jaguar port of Doom was the most popular base for the other ports to build from, but once the 5th console generation was truly underway in the latter half of the 90s, the enhanced PlayStation version became the base for 2 famous competitors. Sega had released their 5th generation console, the Saturn, at roughly the same time as the PlayStation. and its copy of Doom arrived a couple of years later in 1997. This port was handled by Rage Software, and because it was based on the PlayStation version, it inherits its impressive list of Ultimate Doom, Doom 2 and original levels. The UI is practically the same in both the menus and the game, although it does use a new typeface that I think looks a bit better. Unfortunately, that's about the only improvement over the PlayStation version I could find. As soon as you enter E1M1, you'll see the Saturn port is shockingly slow. In fact, it doesn't even compare favourably to the 32X version, despite being made for a console half a generation later. The game has a lot of difficulty when it has to draw anything reasonably far away from the player, and especially when transparent mid-textures are involved. On levels that weren't optimised for the Jaguar, like Perfect Hatred from Episode 4, I would be tempted to call it unplayable. And unlike the 3DO version, there's no way to reduce the screen size to give the game a bit of a break. This slowness isn't the result of any programming incompetence or unrealistic deadlines. Instead, this port has the honour of being personally ruined by John Carmack. After receiving the source code, programmer Jim Bagley was quickly able to write his first version of the game renderer using the Saturn's graphics hardware to play to the console's strengths. However, in Carmack's eyes, the hardware texture handling on the Saturn had a major flaw. It used a fine texture scaling, which I'm not intelligent enough to explain, but it results in the odd warping of textures around the edges of the screen that's characteristic of PS1 games. We'll never know exactly how ugly this version of the renderer was, and if it really deserved to be vetoed like this, but John Carmack asked Jim Bagley to stick to how the PC version drew the game. This meant that the screen drawing routine couldn't involve the faster hardware graphics capabilities of the Saturn, and traded the texture warping problem for being significantly slower. More recently, Carmack has mentioned that he regrets his decision and that it might have been better to allow some experimentation after all, and I'm inclined to agree. Leaving the speed of the renderer aside, which isn't an easy task, there are some more small examples of corner cutting compared to the PlayStation version. The soundtrack goes for the scary angle again, and I thought this was a new set of music, but it's actually made up of a limited selection of abridged versions of Aubrey Hodges' PlayStation soundtrack. It isn't clear to me why the tracks were cut and rearranged in this way, as the Saturn had the same amount of disc capacity available to it as the PlayStation. The coloured lighting has been taken out again, but there seems to be an extra bit of lighting added when firing your weapon. I'm not sure if I'm just imagining it, but I think that the other ports went with just brightening the whole screen slightly when firing, but the Saturn makes more of an effort to make the light look like it's coming from the player. Due to what I can only assume is a programming error rather than conscious choice, the Episode 3 levels don't display the black fiery animated sky the PlayStation had, but instead use the city horizon that usually appears in the middle chapter of Doom 2. This is a pretty big oversight and changes the atmosphere of the hell part of the game quite badly, but if you just pretend hell is in the centre of Milton Keynes, it's much the same thing. There's also something that had been nagging at me while editing this video, and I put my headphones on to check, so I can confirm that in stereo mode, inconsistently, your weapon sounds will suddenly start playing entirely in your left ear. If you're currently wearing headphones, you've no doubt noticed this as well, and I imagine it makes playing the game utterly infuriating. The movement and controls feel a bit strange as well, partly due to the shaky frame rate making them feel unresponsive, but there are oddities on top of that. You'll quickly notice that strafing is extremely sluggish compared to any other version. This means that sidestepping to dodge enemy projectiles, which is usually a vital move against the hordes of hell, suddenly becomes much less feasible. Doomguy certainly doesn't have the mobility necessary to dodge a barrage of Cyber Demon rockets. The engine also seems to have a lot of difficulty when the player walks downstairs, with the view height going through a distracting mad bouncing motion before eventually settling down again. As if to apologise for the slower sidestep and rendering, the firing speed of all the weapons has been sped up considerably. I would estimate that the pistol in particular fires at nearly 3 times the rate it did on the PC, which I appreciate as it makes it a much more viable early weapon. This speed up even applies to the already rapid fire weapons, the chain gun and plasma rifle, allowing you to tear through enemies very quickly despite your diminished manoeuvrability. In a lot of places, this makes the game much easier than it otherwise would be, letting you avoid being penned in by monsters so much during ambushes. The Saturn's controller closely resembled the 6-button Mega Drive pad, but was blessed with shoulder buttons as well, so you would think that it would be able to provide fairly comfortable controls. Unfortunately, it uses its selection of buttons really badly. As usual, the shoulder buttons are for strafing, and 3 face buttons are used for run, fire and open. This leaves 3 for other operations, and immediately Saturn Doom wastes the C button on a redundant strafe on control, not even combining it with the open button like its parent and sibling versions. Next, as Sega's controllers has never included a select button, the Z button goes to bringing up the auto map. This leaves just one button to cycle through all your weapons, the same issue that the Super Nintendo had despite it having 2 fewer face buttons to work with. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a lot that's good to say about this port. Unlike other versions, which usually had things that were unique to them, this one is a derivative of the PlayStation version that doesn't surpass its parent in any way at all or offer anything new. It doesn't even have the excuse that it was running on limited hardware. It was released 2.5 years after the 32X version, which might as well have been several decades in the rapidly evolving technology of the 90s. So this is a part worth skipping. But in the next part, we'll look at what Sega's main rival did with their Doom version that made it one of the ports most worth playing. Thanks once more to everyone listed here for sponsoring my videos. If you'd like to join the Discord or have some ideas for future games to cover, please look at David X Newton on Patreon.